So I apologize for my verbosity. I have a lot of stuff in this lecture as well, so I hope we can kind of get through it. I think lunch is at 12:30, so we won't have time for a discussion immediately after this lecture, but we can do it after the third lecture this evening we get up. So everybody got this handout, lecture 3, Who Am I? So today we're continuing with the who questions. So having wrestled with the notion of who God is, the next one is, who am I? Whom do I believe myself to be? So my father was a very bright man. He was an archaeologist, but he suffered for the last 10 years of his life from dementia, vascular dementia. And it was really upsetting to watch him, deteriorate over the years. But part of what you have to do if you're in a significant relationship with somebody who's, suffering from cognitive decline is to have a sense of humor, because they're going to say the most outrageous stuff and do the most outrageous things. So I want to share a few episodes because it has to do with the notion of how we understand the self. So towards the very, very end, he would spend time, with different of his siblings. So he was staying with his youngest brother, Noel, who's 2 months younger than me, and they're watching television together. And at this stage, he couldn't drive anymore. He wasn't allowed to drive anymore. And whatever program they're watching, there's an advertisement comes on from a car insurance company. And the guy at the other side is looking straight out at the audience and says, "Have you renewed your car insurance?" And my father says, "I don't have a car anymore." So it goes on and the program continues, and 15 minutes later, the same guy comes out and says, "Have you renewed your car insurance?" And my father says, "I told you already, I don't have car insurance." 15 minutes go on, the program proceeds, and the same dude comes back out with the same question, "Have you renewed your car insurance?" My father says, "God almighty, how many bloody times do I have to tell you I don't have a car?" And he's totally convinced that the guy at the other side is really talking to him. So that's kind of the sense of reality. A few months later, at his own house, I went to visit him, and he lived down in West Cork, outside of Skibbereen. And in a fairly remote area, a place called, it was called Tachdarag, Scarty na Killeen, in Skibbereen. Tiny, tiny little remote hamlet. And I go to his house, and he's watching television again. And he's watching a movie, Cleopatra. Remember that one? What was her name? There was an Elizabeth Taylor. And there's this scene of chariots and horses galloping furiously and all kinds of dust and stuff like that. And I said to him, "Dad, let's go out for a walk. Put on your shoes, we'll go for a walk." He was actually a great mountain climber. I said, "Come on, let's go out for a walk." He didn't even look at me. He's glued to television. He says, No, he says, "If I leave this room, we come back here and the whole house would be full of horse poop." He was literally convinced they'd come out of the television and they'd poop all over his floor. So he refused to come out for a walk with me. But maybe the most upsetting one of all was, at one stage, towards the very, very end, he's outside in his own front garden, and the front door is closed, and there was a big glass panel on the front door. And he turns to go back in home, and there's a guy standing inside the door looking at him. And my father says to him, "Get out of my house!" And the guy shouts at him, "Get out of my house!" And my father whispers, "Get out of my house!" And the guy starts waving, "Get out of my house!" So my father takes up a rock and throws it at him and smashes the whole glass, and the guy disappeared. So dead happy, he's got rid of the guy. So literally, he couldn't even recognize himself. So it's interesting to me what it takes for us to define who we are. When I say me, what does that actually mean? So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to talk about this process. I call it the Descent of Incarnation. The way in which our identity changes very significantly at various stages of our devolutionary process and our evolutionary process. So as we come into incarnation, to use the Hindu model, we're stepping ourselves down from 7 different levels of the self. And the me, what I call me typically, the guy who's sitting in a chair, in Healdsburg, with an Irish accent, that's the bottom of the devolutionary process that started with God and just winds up as ego that calls itself Seán at this stage. So what's that devolutionary process that we go through? And it goes through this is a particular kind of typology. Obviously, this is not an accurate description. It's just a kind of it's a model. And we start off with source or God in some senses. And there is only God. And then, as I said this morning, God self-fractures into what we call souls. And she who was transcendent, utterly ineffable, now articulates herself, and is the beginning of the immanence of God. God as will be manifested and articulated through beings and stuff and mountains. So that the second series of the self-identification is now, I'm identified as a soul. The third stage, we go into what the Hindus will call the causal body. And in the causal body, we still retain our psychic abilities. So telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis. So it's the equivalent of what an Irish physicist called John Bell would describe as entanglement theory. So we're all actually interconnected with each other at the causal body level. The next stage down the devolutionary process is we adopt a mental body. Like Plato's ideal realm, the place from which ideation comes a ratiocination, where we can think clearly or have great ideas. We come down a further stage to what Hinduism would call the astral body. And the astral body, I think, has three functions. It's the body we inhabit at night when we dream. It's the body from which we download our emotional reactions to life. And thirdly, it's the place in which we experience parallel lifetimes. So that's the fifth level down. The sixth level down is the etheric body, the energy template out of which will emerge finally the physical articulation that we typically identify as me. So we're at ground zero at that stage. So the devolution is completed almost at that stage. We've gone from identification as God with source to identification with ego in a physical container. So now we have to start the process of evolution, building now from ground zero, from an identification with the ego, and trying to create the trajectory of working our way back up into the mystical union with God. So that's the first point I want to make. As we find ourselves at that very lowest stage, we try to build, I'm going to call it, a pyramid of personal power. So we're going to use the faculties or the resources bestowed upon the incarnated, soul to try to make sense of ourselves, our environment, and then to create reality models. And it goes through the following stages, and I'll tease these out in much more detail. We start with our senses that suck in data from the physical world. That leads to perceptions. The perceptions result in experiences. We store the experiences as memories. The memory creates a sense of individual self, and then finally results in our reality model of what's actually out there. So that's what we attempt to do, all of it pretty much unconsciously, from the time we hit ground zero as human beings. So I'm going to go through these 6 stages sequentially. So firstly, our senses. 1 billion years ago, there was no colour on planet Earth. 1 billion years ago, there was no colour on planet Earth. So am I saying that 1 billion years ago, the sky wasn't blue and grass wasn't green and daffodils weren't yellow? No. I'm saying 1 billion years ago, there was no colour on planet Earth because the eye had not yet been invented. The eye was invented by a little creature called a trilobite about 545 million years ago. So there was no consciousness on planet Earth that could infer colour from the electromagnetic spectrum. So colour did not exist. So in the absence of a particular witnessing consciousness, nature is not free to reveal particular aspects of itself. There has to be an appropriate witnessing consciousness that can infer particular, aspects of nature. And that's why I was fascinated a few nights ago when I heard about this junk DNA that only got triggered in zero gravity and the International Space Station. So obviously, depending on the environment and the witnessing consciousness, nature is not free to reveal particular aspects of itself, which is why a materialistic science, which is dependent only upon sensorium and by extension or instrumentation, will never be able to infer ultimate reality. Unless it's coupled with mysticism, it will not create accurate maps of reality. So we start then with this, for instance, we know that, Light, when it's not being observed, seems to act like a wave. When it is being observed, it seems to act as a particle. So it is the witnessing consciousness that determines the way in which reality articulates and reveals itself. Now, we're operating with just 5 basic senses then as human beings, the ranges of which are really, really limited. So, for instance, our visual ability. Dragonflies have 2,800 facets in each eye. So a dragonfly flying over a field of flowers has a totally different experience from a human being, watching the same field of flowers. Or snakes, for instance, can see into the infrared range. So they have a very different, when a snake looks at a human person, the infrared section lights up. They can see wounds in your body. So we had snakes in Kenya called the spitting cobra. It didn't bite, it spat its venom, and could be deadly accurate, for up to about 5 or 6 yards. And what it did was it saw the human body in infrared. So the eyes or any heat spots from wounds, that's where it would aim the venom. So sound, humans can hear from 20 to 20,000 hertz. If we could hear below 20 hertz, we'd hear our own muscles creaking. So luckily we can't. Bats can hear up to 100,000 cycles per second. So a bat can have an acoustical image of a rose. We can't even imagine what it means to have an acoustical image of a rose. If you look at for instance, if you take the electromagnetic spectrum and you kind of isolate the visible portion of the spectrum, and you were to represent the electromagnetic spectrum as a line joining Los Angeles with New York, 3,000 miles, the physical part of that spectrum would be the diameter of a dime. So that's how limited our sensorium is. So that's what's, allowing us to drink in information from whatever is out there. It's extraordinarily limited. So to attempt to build a cosmology or a reality model based on those on those data is ludicrous. We have to expand our models much bigger than that. So given that that's where we start, with the information gathering, picking up the puzzle pieces, it then leads to perception. And perception is what the black box in here does with the data that come in through the sensorium. And so perception is like a painting of a scene, whereas a photograph, if you compare a photograph of a scene with a painting of a scene, the painting is an impression and an interpretation of the scene. The photograph pretty much represents a one-to-one mapping of what's actually being photographed. But painting is different. The painter is creating a representation or an interpretation of what she's viewing. That's what perception does. Perception is a painting on the basis of the input from outside. And all we can say about perception is that the only thing we can perceive are our perceptions. That was the famous quip of Bishop Berkeley. Bishop Berkeley was an Irish bishop, the 1700s, after whom the university is called. He says the only thing we perceive are our perceptions. We do not perceive reality. We only perceive our perceptions. Now, these perceptions can be widely inaccurate. So, for instance, if you take a girl who's suffering from anorexia, she's looking into a mirror. Her sensorium is delivering to her an accurate picture of who she actually is, but her perception is totally different. And no amount of feedback will persuade her that she's not totally overweight. What she sees and what she perceives are radically different. Her sensorium is working, she's actually seeing what is, but she's perceiving what is not. So in actual fact, through a collaboration done years and years ago with computer scientists and neurosurgeons and psychologists, they figured out that 50% of the visual images that appear on the occipital lobe, when we're looking at something, our images are kind of projected onto the occipital lobe at the back of the head. 50% of the images that are back there are created inside the brain. They're not coming from outside at all. And they're being created by expectations, perceptions, fears, hopes, etc. So 50% of what we're actually seeing, we're not seeing out there. It's a perceptual, issue that's going on. So that's the second stage. A tiny, narrow range of senses feeding inadequate data to a black box that manipulates the data anyway and creates illusions, and partial representations. Now, we then have an experience. Stage 3 is an experience. So the experience is the product of the senses and the perceptions getting together. It's like the meal that's produced with the senses providing the ingredients and perception doing the cooking. So it's the meal you're actually eating. So the ingredients come from your senses, and the cooking is done by perception, and experience then is the meal, that you're actually eating. And we think that this is what actually happened. If I'm going to tell you about an experience this morning, I'm going to tell you something that my sensorium delivered to me, my perception cooked for me, it gave me an experience, and I'm going to tell you now that I had this experience. And a lot of what I'm telling you didn't actually happen. I'm convinced it happened, but it probably didn't happen. So the stage 4 then is that these experiences get archived in quanta, in loads that we call our memory bank. But our memory bank is actually a composite of stuff that really may have happened, movies we've seen, books we've read, expectations we've had. And so it's a whole mixture. And I have no idea. I think, that what I'm recalling is actually accurate, but it's wildly inaccurate most of the time. And there are 2 aspects to memory storage and retrieval. One is called the amygdala and the other is called the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is that part of the limbic system that stores the data of an experience, and the amygdala is the part of the limbic system that stores the associations associated with the data. So let's say, for instance, God forbid, that I had an accident coming here this morning at the crossroads where West Dry Creek meets West Side Road. And I'm telling you about it, this experience months later. And my hippocampus got damaged in the process, so I can't actually store the data. But every time I get to the junction, I start freaking out. And you're with me in the car, and you say, what's wrong with you? I don't know, I just feel weird. So the emotions stored in the amygdala are being triggered, but the hippocampus is offline. If the amygdala were offline and the hippocampus were online, when I drive to this, I'd say, oh yeah, this is where I had an accident 3 years ago and I broke my leg and I was in hospital for 3 weeks. But I have no emotion attached to it. And so even the way it's stored, memories are stored, is problematic right there. Moreover, if you don't retrieve a memory and it's stored there for a long, long time, you lose aspects of it. So you're having a conversation with your siblings about an event that happened when you were, in grade school together. And you say, remember when Mr. Murphy, the teacher, said this? And somebody says, no, I didn't say that. That never happened. So you got totally different memories of what occurred because you haven't visited the memory for a long time. The other problem is every time you take out a memory and you begin telling somebody about it, you change the memory. You put it back in. It's like food in the refrigerator. You cooked it yesterday. You ate some of it. You put it back in the fridge. You take it out today. You eat some more. You put it back into the fridge. After 5 or 6 efforts back in and out of the fridge, it's gone off. It stinks to high heaven. And so if you recall memories too frequently, you abuse them. And if you don't recall them frequently enough, you abuse them. And so there's your memory bank right down there. And there are things like false memories that can actually be implanted. There was a terrible program that the CIA ran in our country in the 1950s called MK Ultra, where through drugs and torture, they were able to erase memories, have people, Manchurian candidates commit executions, erase their memories and implant what they call screen memories through hypnosis and post-hypnotic suggestion, where they could actually erase real memories and implant fictitious ones. And then there's the whole notion of false memory syndrome, when people will remember stuff that they're convinced actually happened to them, abusive situations in childhood, and indeed that does happen, but occasionally it's totally fabricated by some part of the psyche that totally believes this indeed is what occurred. So memory is notorious. And then from this we develop our sense of self. So we've gone from senses to perception, to experience, to memory, and now there is my sense of personal self. At this stage, here's my father looking at the stranger inside his front door and throwing a stone at him, because at this stage he had no sense of personal self. He could not identify himself by any visual feedback. So his sense of self was gone. Now it's interesting that our sense of self is vital for incarnation, but it's actually an illusion, because we're not separate from anything. We're incarnations of Source. But for purposes of incarnation, in order to tie your shoelaces, stop at red lights and pay your taxes, you need a sense of separate self. But it is actually an illusion. And as you work your way back up through the evolutionary ladder, back into union with Source, you realize it had been an illusion all along, an agreed upon illusion for the purposes of incarnation. So that's the trajectory then of this devolutionary process and the evolutionary journey back, which I'm going to call the Ascension Project. In this journey back, the lowest point is the sense of separate self predicated on the notion of an ego, where I'm separate from you, I'm separate from God, and I'm separate from nature. Now, if we begin living life with awareness, we're going to try to undo all of that damage and all of that amnesia and begin to recover who we really are. And we're going to step ourselves back, through that process. So I think there are 3 different tracks to this ascension process, and I'm only going to deal with 2 of them in this lecture. So the first track is the journey of the individual soul over the course of one lifetime. So in this lifetime, each of us is tasked with becoming enlightened, and we can accomplish it in one lifetime. It only takes one lifetime to wake up totally, if we go about it correctly. So the first track of the Ascension Project is a soul dedicated to enlightenment in the course of this present lifetime. The second track I'll mention is the journey of a soul over many lifetimes, the trajectory over parallel lifetimes or reincarnational lifetimes. That for the vast bulk of us is going to take many, many, many iterations before we're awake enough, and conscious enough to actually let go, finally, even of the illusion of soul, because soul is the final illusion on the way back to God. And then the third track of this process, but I'm not going to deal with it in this retreat, is the evolutionary trajectory of the entire human race, plus all sentient beings, plus the cosmos itself, over the lifespan of the universe. And I'm totally convinced that the universe itself is on an evolutionary trajectory where all sentient beings, and in fact the universe itself, is in a journey of recovering of its identity of who it really is. But that maybe that's the topic for another retreat with God's help. So let me look at the first 2 then, the individual track over one lifetime and then the individual track over several lifetimes. And there's a lot of information here I want to cover, so I may go through this fairly quickly. Every culture on the planet ritually honors the progression of the entire tribe or even the universe through great periods of times. Hinduism will call these the yugas or the Maha yugas, and they'll be like 4.32 million year chunks of time. So all cultures, the great Mesoamerican cultures, the Mayan cultures have divided life into these great chunks of time and believe that the universe itself is working through these. Like there's the precession of the equinoxes, which happens over a 2,660-year period. And then there's the movement of, our solar system through our Milky Way galaxy, which is in a realm of hundreds of millions of years. And then there's the precession of Milky Way galaxy around the cosmic center, which is billions of years. So there are these great cycles of time that all great thinking cultures have ritualized in their calendar making. We also do it in in a fractal versions of shorter periods of time. Like we'll map the seasons of the year, or the phases of the moon, or the perennial dance of day and night. So we're fascinated at the ritualizing of the cycles, the time cycles, the temporal kinds of constituents of this journey. And embedded within all those cultures, whether you're talking about Mahayugas or you're talking about the seasons, is the wondrous mystery, equally mysterious, of the individual soul during incarnation. And so we ritualize that through ceremonies like baptism or first communion or confirmation or bar mitzvah or the driving license. So we're constantly creating sacraments. And so sacraments then, in some senses, are the rites of passage as the incarnated soul steps itself and is recognized by society for stepping itself through these stages. And it's sinking culture and nature. In Celtic mythology, we believe that the goddesses are the archetypes of nature and the gods are the archetypes of culture. And in the Celtic mythology, these dance together. They're not enemies of each other. It's not that darkness swallows up light. It is that that darkness gives birth to light. So the beginning of the day starts with night, and the beginning of the year starts with the autumn, and it gives birth to the light subsequently. So there's this dance between culture and nature, between the goddesses and the gods. And so this is a cosmic dance, and it is also an individual dance. So great thinkers have tried to map these movements of incarnation. And so you have Shakespeare, you're talking about the 7 ages of man. All the world is a stage, and all the men and women merely players, each man in his time playing seven parts. So Shakespeare will break it up into 7 segments. If you've ever studied developmental psychology, Erik Erikson came up with this great notion of 8 stages of the psychosocial development of the human. Confucius believed that there were 5 constant relationships that cycled people through incarnation. He called them the 5 constant relationships. There's the relationship of husband to wife, relationship of parents to children, relationship of elder brother to younger siblings, relationship of teacher to student, and relationship of emperor to the subjects. So these were the kind of the stages for a Chinese woman or man. The Celts had their own version of it, which was to divide time and space into thin places, veils in which there was an interpenetration and intercommunication between the upper realms, the middle realms, and the lower realms. The shamanistic cultures had the very same idea. Catholicism broke it into 7 sacraments, starting with baptism and ending with the anointing of the sick. And the Kalenjin peoples among whom I worked, had their birth ceremonies, ceremonies to initiate people into warriorhood, and ceremonies to initiate people into elderhood. There were actual ceremonies where somebody went from being, a warrior to being an elder, or being a mother to being an elder. So the entire society celebrates these rites of passage. And in traditional societies, these are not just excuses to party, and to drink beer. They're very, very significant, because you're recognizing not just the privileges that the initiated is now going to get, but also the responsibilities that they have. And very, very often these traditional cultures will create ceremonies where somebody is ritually and very realistically and frighteningly confronted with the possibility of real death. Circumcision is a kind of a mild version of that. But there are versions where literally 13 or 14-year-old boys are literally traumatized to the point of death by the encounters in order to make sure they're able to move between the dimensions. And then the initiate now has grown up really, really quickly. They now have privileges that they weren't previously accorded, but they now also have responsibilities that the entire tribe expects them to fulfill. So it's taken really seriously. It's not just a fun thing like a bar mitzvah or a party after your confirmation. So that would be the journey of a single incarnation for a single soul. But the soul itself rarely accomplishes that kind of evolution in the course of one lifetime, one incarnation. So we're going to come back again and again and again and again. So I created a model years ago where I think that, these stages are basically sacraments. And if I were to give my definition of a sacrament, I define sacrament as following. I would say that it is the mindful ritualizing of the significant shifts of both status and obligation of the initiate into the wider community. Let me just read that again for you. It is the mindful ritualizing of the significant shifts of both status and obligation of the initiate in the wider community. So it has privileges and obligations, and it's ritualized by the entire group to signify that the initiate is stepping into a new phase of life. And I've identified 22 or 23 of these stages over many, many lifetimes. So obviously I'm going to have to go through them really, really quickly. If we get time at the end, we can kind of talk about them, or this evening perhaps. So the first one, I believe, the first sacrament of all, is God self-fracturing into fractal souls. So there's this unity consciousness that for purposes of experience, self fractures into souls. That's the first sacrament. The second sacrament, I believe, is that individual fractals or souls now volunteer for incarnation. The third sacrament, I believe, I call it the launching pad. And I had this experience in a deep hypnotic regression with a friend of mine who was also a clinical psychologist, Matt Mackay, years and years and years ago in a 4-hour hypnosis session. A launching pad where souls literally are launched into incarnation in a plethora of dimensions and planets and worlds. Not just, they don't all sign up just for planet Earth. That, I believe, will be sacrament number 3, the launching pad. Number 4, the fourth sacrament, the soul docks with a developing embryo or fetus in utero. I don't necessarily believe that, as the Catholic Church teaches, that God just creates a brand new soul at the moment of conception and infuses the zygote, with the new soul, and then we're off to the races. I think that the soul can dock with the developing embryo or fetus at any stage of in utero. So I would believe that that's the fourth sacrament. The docking process is the fourth sacrament. The fifth sacrament, I would say, is the birth, and particularly the first breath. So in many languages, a single word does triple duty. It can mean breath, it can mean life, or it can mean spirit. So, for instance, in Hebrew it's called ruach. Ruach means to be breath, life, spirit. The Greeks will call it pneuma. In Swahili we call it pepo. And even in English, inspiration. Inspiration means to breathe in, to be alive, or to be creative. And expiration means to breathe out, or to die, or to let go of spirit. So birth and the first breath, I believe, is the fifth sacrament. The sixth sacrament, I believe, is the development of ego. And this is a really frightening stage in a child's life. For the first several months of his life, a child acts as if it's part of the mother-child complex. It does not differentiate itself from mother. It's totally convinced there's only one organism. Now, obviously, it's not cognitively thinking these thoughts, but is acting as if there's only a single organism called the mother-child complex. And the child part of it is in charge. So the child is hungry and it screams, and all of a sudden, a breast appears and suckles it. The child is cold, and suddenly somebody picks it up and cuddles it. The child is frightened, and somebody turns on the lights, and talks to it. And so, but the child is in charge of the entire process. And then somewhere around age 8 months is this horrible realization, oh my God, it's not one complex. There are 2 parts to this equation, and the other part is in the power position. She can abandon me. And this is the evolution of the ego. It's a terrible realization. And it's part of the agreement. We talked this morning about kids between 4 to 12, in a sense, having to go through the low point. The ego is a very important part of that process, where the soul coming in is further separating itself in the horrible realization, my God, I am totally alone in this venture. Nobody is there for me. And then we have to develop all kinds of defense mechanisms to counteract, for this process. So we can decide to be really nice and cuddly, hoping that mommy will really love me, or be really obnoxious and scream and control her. So we develop all these defense mechanisms with the development of the ego. So the ego being number 6. Really frightening and very important in the journey of our separation from Source. Number 7, I think, would be age 1. We become literally Homo erectus. We're learning to stand upright and to walk around. So it's, phylogeny, ontogeny, recapitulating phylogeny. That what the human species accomplished over, tens of thousands of years, the little infant is telescoping into less than 12 months. So the child becomes Homo erectus sometimes around year 1. That's sacrament number 7. Number 8, I think, around age 2. So we become Homo sapiens sapiens. We start developing language skills. This happens around age 2. We begin putting sentences together. That would be sacrament number 8 for me. Number 9 is we start off with language and we're crowd pleasers. We begin to say dada, mama, And they're cute. It's lovely. Everybody loves to hear, say dada or mama. So the child is being a crowd pleaser at this stage because the ego needs to try to manipulate the situation. But very, very quickly, the child gets fed up with being a crowd pleaser and he starts using other words like, no, mine, I want it. So now, this is almost as low as we get in the evolution away from source. Now we're not even identified with parents. Now we're really, really at the bottom of the barrel. So there's this really deepening sense of separation from parents at this stage, from God and from soul. And this is necessary, it can't be avoided. The child is going to go through it. Now we're going to, either protect that process or support that process or, make this process work over the next years through our education. So sacrament number 10 for me is around age 7. When the child is beginning to be indoctrinated and licked into control, and it learns basically 2 things, rules and roles. Here are the rules in this family or this culture, and here's your role in this family or this culture. As a boy, you have to do this. As a girl, you're expected to do that. As a member of this family, as distinct from the assholes who live next door, here's what we expect from you and your behaviour. They can do what they want. So we have these rules and we got these roles, that you're expected. So that's number 10 for me. Around age 12, you become sexually mature. And so for the first time ever, you become capable of being a conduit for other souls to incarnate, which is a huge responsibility. And at this stage, society really constricts our ability to kind of manifest that ability, and rightly so in some senses. So there are more rules and more hypocrisy around sexuality than about any other part of the human psyche. You get both the rules and the protection and extraordinary hypocrisy around sexuality. And that comes around age 12. At this stage as well, we're going to really tightly regulate our kids at this stage because they get into all kinds of trouble doing that. Shortly after that, we have the 12th sacrament, I believe, and that's the development of self-reflection. For the first time ever, the child is beginning to question their own performance and their own values, and question the values and the performance of the culture, including the religion they were brought up in, and the kind of the nation of which they became a part. And this is a huge challenge to the tribal. We began to, challenge the tribal stories, whether they're historical stories, or theological stories, or cosmological stories. And we start moving from ethnocentric thinking into world-centric thinking. Ages 12, 13, 14, 15. Kids are really moving into try to embracing a worldview rather than a kind of a national, or a particular denominational viewpoint. And this really frightens the culture and people and parents. So we really, really try to ride, gunshot on kids at this stage. We really try to close them down and get them focused on the group, on the nation, on the religion, or whatever. Number 13 for me is the first romantic friendship. And it's puppy love at that stage. It's hormonally driven, basically. But we all think that, that the sun and the moon and the stars shine out of my beloved. And nobody can persuade me otherwise. Nobody can tell me that, oh yeah, that happened to me when I was your age. No, it never happened to you like it's happening to me. It's very, very different. So we're totally convinced that, it's different for me. Nobody has ever gone through this experience like me. That's a sacrament. And it's a preparation for the real thing when that arrives. And that would be sacrament number 14. I would call that the first committed long-term relationship, which very, very often then leads to a socially sanctioned union that we call marriage. And so you've, maybe had several heartbreaks in your life, and now you've met your soulmate and you've done the work necessary to create, a marriage out of a relationship. You're learning to listen better, to communicate better, to be less egoic in your demands. And so it takes time to grow into that. Christ would put it very powerfully. He said, marriage goes through 3 stages. Leave your father's house, cleave to your spouse, and the two become one flesh. And it takes years and years and years, in my opinion, for that to happen. Leaving your father's house doesn't mean that when you get married, you move from Palo Alto to Menlo Park. Doesn't mean that. It means that your primary affiliation is no longer to your family of origin. It is now to your beloved. So that's the first stage, leaving your father's house. The second stage is cleaving to your spouse. It doesn't mean bear hugging each other. It means having the courage to share everything. Your finances, your fears, your dreams, your future, your children, perhaps. And stage 3 is the two have become one flesh. But the word that Jesus is using in Hebrew does not mean this stuff. It means that your twin souls dancing together. And so it takes a long time to to grow into that. That's a sacrament that takes a long time to actually get celebrated. That would be sacrament number 14 for me. Number 15 then, sacrament number 15, would be the adoption of a profession. So you've trained, you've learned the profession, a skill set, or you've got to college or whatever, and now you're out in the world trying to make a living. And this stage again is a dangerous stage because there's a tendency now to regress from your world-centric thinking to another kind of ethnocentric or even family-centric. Now, you're going to thinking about, I got to make a buck here, I got to pay the mortgage here, I got to buy a car here or whatever. And so you get more and more focused on the smaller unit again. So there's a little bit of a regression of the accordion happening at that stage, number 15. Number 16, I think, is the birth of your first child. Now, you probably never experienced love like that before. No matter how much you were in love with your partner, the fact that you see this extraordinary creature that you've created, or at least mediated into incarnation, is an awe-inspiring experience for all of you parents out there. And you fall in love in a way you've never been in love before. And again, the tendency is to further restrict your concern. You're focused on this little baby and protecting it and making sure nothing bad happens to it. And you can get even develop phobias about letting the child out of your sight or letting it go to school at age 4. So there's a regression that happens because of this extraordinary focused, loving attention on the infant. Number 17, I think, is the birth of your first grandchild. And now it begins to expand a little bit. Because with the birth of your first grandchild, you're beginning to realize more that all of the children of the world are precious. Not even just the children of your children, but all children are. So you're much more likely at this stage to get involved in projects that benefit, the children of the world, whether they live in Ethiopia or East Palo Alto, whatever they are. So that would be number 17. Number 18, I think, is that the embrace of planet Earth herself. The realization that that it was she who gave birth to you. And now you have a totally different relationship to life and to the planet and to the abuse that she is experiencing. That leaves the sacrament number 19, which I think is enlightenment. And the first the first real sign of enlightenment, I believe, is laughter.
Is what?
Laughter. The ability to laugh at the illusion through which you've lived the first part of your life. And this is not a derisory laughter or a mocking laughter. It's just, it's the way you laughed when your little child was learning to stand and she fell on her butt 45 times and picked herself up and then learned to stand and walk. It's the laughter, at what your child is achieving. So this is the laughter, I think, that comes with enlightenment. That you can really genuinely laugh at the mystery of life, because it's wondrous and it's destined only for one end, and that's total union with Source eventually. And then you really understand what Namaste means. It's not just a quaint, Hindu custom, of putting your hands together and bowing. It's meeting an oak tree or a rabbit, and really recognizing that it's God, in rabbit form or oak tree form. Number 20, I believe, is the sacrament of death, of shuffling off the mortal coil and identifying with your soul. Number 21, I believe, is taking the Bodhisattva vow. There's a belief system in Buddhism that there are great souls like a Buddha figure or a Jesus figure who've worked off all their own personal karma. There's no growing left to do. They know who they are. They recognize who everybody else is in their essence. But they can't rest in nirvana. They can't just stay there and watch the rest of us, labor in the illusion. So they keep reincarnating to try to wake up the rest of us. Now, I think to the extent that we're altruistic, every one of us is operating out of a bodhisattva vow. To the extent that you can think of others, it's part of the vow you've taken to come back, and to reincarnate and to wake up the rest of us. So that would be number 21. And number 22 is, once more you parachute back into incarnation, or you become aware of a parallel lifetime you're currently living. But at this stage, you realize that your forgetting is just merely cryptamnesia. Cryptamnesia is the notion that you've learned something in the past, but you've forgotten you knew it, and now it pops back up into memory as a new learning, but it's not actually a new learning. It's just you're actually remembering something you previously knew. And so at some stage of our reincarnational process, we can dissolve the cryptamnesia much more quickly than we could resolve a memory loss. We realize, okay, I recognize this. I recognize the signs here. I know where this is going. And then you can start accelerating through the process of being a little child, developing an ego, learning to stand, learning to walk, learning to kind of see a God in your own children. You can accelerate through that process. So it's like you become a powerful wave washing up onto the beach to retrieve all of those water droplets that were deposited by a previous wave and are stuck on the beach, each as a discrete little water droplet sitting there alone and isolated. And you gather them back up and you bring back into the bosom of Mother Ocean, which is God, our source itself. So you bring them back into the ocean of God. And in the final sacrament, number 23, the game of Lila is done. All souls have awoken. And finally, they've let go of the final illusion. The first illusion on the way out, and the last illusion on the way back. And it's the illusion that I'm a separate soul. I recognize the divinity in everything else, but I still think I'm a fractal of source. I now realize that that actually is a dream. That life is a dream which the ego is having. That the ego is a dream that the soul is having. That soul is a dream that spirit is having, and that spirit is a dream that source is having. And the dream ends, and there is only God, and God folds up, everything merges with God. And I just wonder, what will be the next dream she'll have? So we got a few minutes, guys. There's also another handout I wanted to mention where this afternoon, after lunch, do you want to hand it there, Karen? After lunch, you have several hours free. When are we back? What does the schedule say? When is the first lecture after? So we're not back here until 4 o'clock after lunch. So you're totally free to work this material any way you want. You can do it individually. If you want to do it in a small group format, that's great as well. But there's a little handout you're going to get, which are just a few questions that will kind of provoke some ideas for you. So let me just quickly walk us through that. So just to prime the pump of your kind of exploration as individuals or as groups, whatever you choose to do it, from Monday we're focusing obviously on the who questions. So I'm going to ask you in your thinking to divide your life into 3 chunks. From birth to the end of grade school, from the beginning of high school to your graduation from college, and then from college graduation to now. And to ask yourself these questions. Whom did I understand God to be during each of these stages? Whom did I understand myself to be during those stages? And whom did I understand my neighbour to be? We're going to do the lecture on neighbour at 4 o'clock, but just to prime the pump for it. So to kind of focus on that, just to help you get you thinking about what we've discussed this morning.